All right, it has just gone past 6 p.m. on Tuesday, the 21st of October. My name is Chris Hutting. I'm the Executive Director at the Center for Risk Analysis. You are joining us for our latest exclusive client briefing. Today, we're going to talk about a difficult topic, but one very much top of mind, I think, at this point in time, despite the positive sentiment around the GNU, little bits of reform elements here and there from some departments. We are not seeing the economy grow. We're not seeing investment pick up. And what that means is that South Africa's middle class continues to be under immense pressure. Very much the engine should be the engine of our economy, under various pressures from a service delivery point of view, from an inflation point of view, from a government policy point of view. All of those things continue to stifle the potential of South Africa's middle class. And joining us to unpack what all of this means on the back of our latest macro review report on the state of the middle class is Mr. Gerbrandt van Heerden. Harry, thank you very much for making time for us today. Looking forward to the analysis you will bring to the table. Just before I hand over to you, a little bit of housekeeping and admin. This webinar, this briefing will be recorded. So if anyone has to drop off for any reason, maybe some load shedding or inconsistent Wi-Fi connection, the full session will be recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel. Also, we invite you to submit any discussion points or questions to us throughout Gerbrandt's presentation, and I will field those questions in our Q&A discussion towards the end of the session. With that, and without any further ado, I will hand over to Gerbrandt to take us through South Africa's stifled middle class. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. And thank you everyone for joining us at this very late hour of the day. As Chris mentioned, my name is Gerbrandt van Heerden. I helped put together our September macro review, which looked at South Africa's middle class, the size of the middle class, and how resilient this very important socio-economic group is. So without further ado, I'm going to take you through some of the findings of the report. So first and foremost, what are we going to look at specifically? Firstly, we're going to look at why the middle class matters. Why is the middle class important? After that, we're going to profile the middle class, who exactly lives a typical middle class lifestyle. And then we're going to look at how resilient or fragile this group is. Is it prospering? Is it currently fragile and vulnerable? What is happening with this group? And then we're going to see what the current state of the middle class means for the South African economy before we conclude with some key takeaways. Now, why does the middle class matter? Well, first and foremost, they drive consumer demand. A strong and stable middle class contributes highly significantly to the economy because they reflect a significant consumer base with a high purchasing power. And we're going to look at how much exactly the economy depends on the consumption of the middle class later in this webinar. The middle class cohort are also great job creators. This cohort has the resources, the skills, and the expertise to pursue successful entrepreneurial activities, create big businesses, which down the line creates a number of job opportunities and prospects. The middle class also contributes significantly to skills development by investing in education significantly, which also helps to encourage human capital accumulation. Also, which is something that we will also explore later on in this webinar, is how much of the government's revenue depends on the middle class. And then also the middle class is a significant driver to social stability in the country. Many middle class members have access to home ownership, to private medical aid, and because of this, they will be resistant to populist style policies such as the national health insurance, policies that weaken property rights. So they do have they do play a moderate role in our political system. Now, who is the middle class? Well, there are many studies that have been done about this group in South Africa. Many of them use income as the main factor to determine who falls into this category. And based on different studies, the income thresholds differ. And so to define the middle class is a bit of a complex endeavor. So what we did in our macro review report is we didn't just look at income, we also looked at a variety of other indicators that are indicative and typical of a middle class lifestyle. One of the first indicators that I will take you through is the household expenditure of 10,000 Rand or more per month. So this is the highest expenditure threshold from Status A's General Household Survey. And it's a modest threshold. 10,000 Rand isn't that much per month, especially if you live in a metropolitan city, especially in Cape Town. But it is useful to look at the highest expenditure threshold. And this graph specifically looks at household spending of 10,000 Rand or more per month in 2024, broken down by race. Now, the little red square on the left shows that only 14% of Black households in the country are able to afford to spend 10,000 Rand or more per month. Compare that to the tall skyscraper, the gray skyscraper at the right, which represents white households. That shows 74% of white households spend 10,000 Rand or more. So there's definitely a lot of inequality that still persists, and the overall national picture shows that 20.5% of households can spend at least 10,000 Rand per month. Now, previous studies by the CRA have shown that having a tertiary education is a good indicator of middle class status as well, because from the studies that we've done, if you have a tertiary education, you are at least twice as likely to find a job compared to someone that only completed high school or that only has some level of high school education. Now, this graph looks at people aged 20 and above with a degree or higher between 2009 and 2024, and it also breaks it down by race. Now, the first red line represents Black South Africans, and you can see from 2009, the line kind of skews slightly more up as time goes by, which means that more and more Black people have over time gotten access to tertiary education. And the same can be said for the colored population, the Indian population, and the white population. But like in the previous slide, there is some racial disparities that still exist in 2024. Now, what we've also looked at in the report when defining the middle class is how many people can afford to state-proof their homes. It's no secret that in South Africa, there's a lot of problems relating to basic service delivery in terms of water infrastructure, rail and road infrastructure, sanitation facilities, public healthcare and public education facilities. So due to those issues, those who can afford to opt out of state-provided services, that is one indicator that we also looked at when defining the middle class. For example, how many people are using private medical aid? And this is what this graph is going to show us. It shows trends from 2009 up until 2024. And the number of people with a medical aid or with access to a medical aid policy have kind of stagnated over the last, between 2009 and 2024. In fact, it's actually slightly declined from 17% to 13.9%. It should also be noted that the majority of people with a medical aid now are Black South Africans. We don't have a racial breakdown here, but that is what our sources have shown. Then, of course, security, one of the biggest issues in South Africa. Previous CRA polling has shown on a consistent basis that the two most important issues for South Africans in this country is employment, or rather unemployment, and crime and safety. And so if households can afford to get access to a neighborhood watch, to get a private security vehicle to patrol their streets during the day and night, then they will definitely do so. And so this graph shows us access to a home security service by province. So we're also bringing in the geographical location factor. And when I reveal the bars here, it's clear that South Africa's most urbanized and wealthiest provinces, Gauteng and the Western Cape, represented by the light orange and the red bars. These are the two provinces where there is a significant number of people with access to a home security service, 19% in Gauteng and 17% in the Western Cape. So that shows us that wealthier households are most likely to reside or at least move to Gauteng and the Western Cape. Now compare that to the more rural provinces, the more underdeveloped provinces, and we see a completely different picture. The Eastern Cape, the Free State, Northwest, and the Northern Cape, only 5% in those provinces have access to a home security service. Now, in terms of transport, it's also no secret that South Africa is really struggling with its public transport, especially with railways and the bus systems. And so once again, if households can afford to own their own private vehicles, so as to avoid using public transport, they would take that avenue as well. So let me just break down this little pie chart for you. The red slice here shows the proportion of people who walk to work. Then the gray the gray slice shows the proportion of people who use a minibus taxi. And of course, those are the people who live in more underprivileged areas, where the railway systems and the bus systems are particularly unreliable. And so 24% of people use minibus taxi in order to get to work. But then the green slice to the left, 26%, that represents the people who use their own car or private vehicle to travel towards work. And I think that is indicative of people who are at least part of the aspirant middle class category. Now, based on these statistics and from the figures in our report, we can gauge that the middle class in South Africa hovers around the 15, 20%, 25% mark. So the country's middle class is still small after 30 years of democracy. And there's also a lot of issues that is prohibiting the growth and the expansion of this group, which is what we're going to see now in the following section. Now, middle class households or high income earners are currently very pessimistic. This slide shows us the Consumer Confidence Index results from the Bureau of Economic Research. And what we see here with this red line is that in Q4 of 2024, consumer confidence had a negative 4% index points. So consumers were negative. That plummeted to minus 30 in Q1 of 2025. That recovered slightly to minus 11 in the second quarter of 2025. But the overall picture here is that consumer sentiment for high income earners remains negative. And I will also add here that high income earners refers to those earning more than 20,000 Rand a month. Consumers are also highly in debt. And this is a chart taken from Debt Busters, and it shows original overall debt to income. It is broken down by different income, monthly income categories. This red bar is the lowest income category, representing those earning between 0 and 5,000 Rand per month. And if I can just draw your eyes to the right side of the chart, representing Q1 of 2025, you can see that the debt to income ratio for low income households was 60%. So debt represented 60% in comparison to income for low income households. But if you look at the higher income households, which is represented by the dark green bars, that specifically refers to households earning 35,000 Rand or more per month. You can see the debt burden surge with the debt income ratio representing 180%. In comparison to income. So the takeaway point here is that high income earners are highly burdened by debt, and that is forcing them to divert or allocate money from necessary expenditure items towards servicing the debts and managing their debt. Now here we have two pie charts, one showing levels of financial distress in 2018, as well as levels of financial distress in 2025. So I want to draw your attention to the red slices of the pie charts. Those show the proportion of high income earners who feel overwhelming stress. Now in 2018, 4% felt overwhelming stress, and that has since tripled to 12% in 2025. And the large orange or yellow slices, rather, on the pie charts, that represents high income earners that experience low financial distress. And that proportion has declined from 50% in 2018 to 46% in 2025. So a gradual deterioration in the financial satisfaction of high income earners and middle class members. Now, what is limiting the growth of the middle class? Well, the government's poor policy choices over the last 30 years. The policy status quo at the moment is not conducive to investment and to economic growth, and that's severely inhibiting job creation and the middle class as well. And I'm talking about policies that are very hostile towards business and have also indirectly led to a surge of corruption. These include transformation policies from the government, as well as policies such as expropriation without compensation, which has really increased South Africa's risk premium and has scared off investment. Another big factor which should be considered is the decay of municipalities and basic service delivery, which has ultimately led to the phenomenon known as double tax. And it's something that I already discussed earlier in this webinar, but it essentially refers to people who can afford to opt out of basic state-provided services, private healthcare, private education, basically funding your own services. And so with the tax that the middle class already has to pay, they now have to pay additional tax to keep their areas functioning. And then, of course, what's really inhibiting upward mobility in South Africa is just the poor lack of access to quality education. A recent article quoted the Minister of Basic Education, which revealed that only 6% of, or rather over 6% of public schools don't offer mathematics, and 12% don't offer physics and chemistry. And some of the data in our own survey shows that between 50 to 80% of state schools don't have a library, don't have computer facilities, don't have the basic fundamental blocks to ensure that pupils and students are getting that strong educational foundation that they need to move up in society. Now, the middle class is struggling. And what does that mean for our economy? Well, our economy is extremely dependent on consumption expenditure. Now, this graph shows final consumption expenditure as a proportion of GDP, gross domestic product, between 2001 and 2024. And as you can see, up until 2024, household consumption expenditure that's consumption expenditure by households, represented here by the red bars, floated above the 65% mark compared to the orange bars, which shows general government. So our economy is highly dependent on consumption expenditure by households. And if the middle class comes under pressure, if they come under strain, they're going to stop spending. They're going to rein in their expenditure. And that's going to have a disproportionate impact on the country's GDP and growth prospects. Now, another worrying picture is just how much tax revenue the government can extract for services and grants. This little red square on the left shows the number of assessed individual taxpayers in South Africa, which is around 6.6 million. The orange square shows the number of people employed in the country. That's around 16.7 million. But then when you look at the gray bar, that shows total grants, and that includes the COVID-19 Social Relief of Distress Grant. So all the grants, including the COVID-19 grant, amounts to 27.7 million grants that need to be paid out every month. And then the green bar, the final bar, that is South Africa's total population of 63.1 million people, which all require access to various types of infrastructure, roads, schools, hospitals, clinics, and all that needs to be funded by this little red square on the left. And so there's a huge burden on taxpayers and the middle class to pay for the necessary services and infrastructure to keep South Africa functioning. So to conclude, before we move over to the Q&A section, South Africa's middle class is small. It's unable to expand under the government's current policy status quo. Municipal decay is not helping. It's creating a lot of major obstacles for further expansion of the middle class. They're heavily burdened by debt and double tax, and that's placing a huge risk on the country's ability to extract tax. So with that, I'm going to hand back to my colleague, Chris, to manage the Q&A. Thank you.
Great stuff. Thank you very, very much, Gerbrandt, for a very informative presentation, really highlighting, I think, the different pressure points on the South African middle class and why it is so important for that middle class to find some breathing room where possible. I think maybe to get off, to sort of kick off the discussion Q&A section, and a reminder again, if you have any questions for us, please do pop those in the comment box on the respective platform where you're joining our briefing today. Maybe just a thought around administered prices, and by administered prices I refer to the prices and tariffs set by government, so be it national government, provincial, metro, things like electricity prices and tariffs, water tariffs, waste management, all sorts of levies that different kinds and forms of governments implement that, of course, impact on businesses in those given geographical areas, but then, of course, also on the middle class, on citizens, taxpayers who live in those areas. We've seen, just as I think the main headline grabbing administered price that has increased over the last 10 to 15 years so much is electricity prices. So, Gerbrandt, if we're starting to see a bit more competition maybe for Eskom, if we see some kind of unbundling. Perhaps we'll see different forms of electricity tariffs implemented. But I think if you could just talk to us a little bit about, from government side, why it's so important to try and keep a handle on, massively overinflated, more than inflation price increases, and how much that impacts, I think, on the middle class.
Yeah, inflation is a huge barrier on middle class finances. I think the issue is that the state, with its policy status quo, is severely hurting competition in the market. We see with, as you mentioned, electricity prices. That has increased significantly over the last 10 years, 15 years. South Africa was one of the countries with one of the cheapest form of electricity, and due to the mismanagement of Eskom, the sole monopoly that the government has on energy provision, and then with all of the issues, corruption, the exodus of skills, and of course stage 8 load shedding that has really assaulted the country's economy in the last 10, 15 years. That has led to a severe erosion of business prosperity, people's financial standings. I mean, there's plenty of studies that have shown that businesses, especially in township areas, do not have the type of backup power to remain open or to continue to function when there is load shedding, and so just the severe decay and deterioration of a state provided a service such as electricity has led to massive job losses over the last decade, and that's of course had a ripple effect on those who, such as the middle class, who still have the finances to subsidize where the government is failing, but it's really it's adding another burden on a small cohort that's already paying for their own services.
Exactly. And I do want to, maybe on that point, reinforce what the governor of the Reserve Bank, Lesetja Kganyago, has tried to say at many opportunities, expressing his frustration with his government colleagues in other government institutions and departments, where the sort of basic line is, the Reserve Bank can cut interest rates. That would stimulate some kind of economic activity. Of course, it would help, I think, in some limited instances. But if on the supply side, if on things like electricity prices, water prices, those sorts of things, if those just keep on inordinately increasing, the pressure points on businesses in the middle class simply continue, regardless of interest rate cuts. So it might help some businesses take on more credit or more debt, might help with some loans, give some breathing room. But if other government departments and entities don't get their financial house in order, don't start to bring down some of those prices, it almost undermines anything that the Reserve Bank can do on the interest rate side. Gerbrandt, a question around, or two questions that I'll combine into one around the informal economy, or at least the so-called informal economy. We consistently see reporting. Earlier this year, we had the CEO of Capitec talking about unemployment linked to the informal economy. Just last week, we had a study published by Standard Bank on smaller businesses linked also to the informal parts of the informal economy. Any thoughts for us on the possible size or contribution of the informal economy? I guess by definition, it is not tracked by entities like Stats SA, the Reserve Bank. But that informal economy in the South African context, I think, plays a very important role in terms of some kind of economic activity, some kind of income and stability. There will be those kinds of businesses that do pay different forms of VAT. For example, they might not pay all of it, and it might not all be above above board, but they do in the form of fuel levies and other contributions paid to things like VAT. I think if we could look at elements of formalizing the informal economy, supporting it, you could really see a big contribution to the tax base and also to the more formal economy. What do you think in terms of that particular question?
Yeah, I think it's difficult to gauge the actual size of the informal economy. I think one has to consider the fact that a lot of the businesses operating in the informal economy are purely survivalist and very, very small in scale, and these are people who do anything or try anything to just eke out a sort of living to make it at the end of the month. And the problem here is the informal economy, especially in the township areas, are severely hampered by a lack of public infrastructure, which really damages the businesses there. It damages the potential of the economic contribution from the informal economy. And so it's if there's any sort of potential from the informal economy, it is severely being inhibited by the government's poor planning and policies. And it's unable. The informal economy is not able to really drive employment in South Africa. For example, there was a significant number. I can't remember the figures off the top of my head, but when there was advertisements for employment in the police service, thousands and thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people in South Africa applied to get into the police force. And that just shows you the significant extent of unemployment in South Africa, and that the informal economy is not able to really provide meaningful employment or the type of employment that helps people to uplift themselves from extreme poverty. It's survivalist. It's keeping people above the breadline, but it's not doing anything more than that. What we need is a government that makes it easier for people, especially in less privileged areas, to be able to get a good access to education, or at least skills that would help them to enter the formal economy, where they have greater greater access to protection, working rights, but also income. And that could significantly stimulate their opportunities for upward mobility.
Very good. Thank you, Harry. A question around whether we have any evidence that a middle class aspiration exists in lower income households. I'll try to tackle this one, but please feel free to add to my answer, Harry. So number one, I mean, we consistently see year after year in CRA polling, where we poll registered voters, when you ask questions around sort of quality of life, priorities that voters, that South African citizens expect the government, issues that expect the government to prioritize. You see across racial lines, across income strata in South Africa, but also especially pronounced in lower income brackets, because our polling is done in such a way to be representative of the South African society. You see a real focus on aspirational middle class sort of goals, as it were. So medical aid, a house, a motor vehicle, reliable, safe food security and food supply, good schooling for their children. There's very radical things that South Africans, especially lower to middle income households, want to be prioritized and that they aspire towards. I think we see that very much across the board in our polling. And you also are starting to see it, I think, in some ways in voting patterns, where the latest example earlier this year around the budget and the VAT increase, many South Africans focused there when they were polled towards parties that focused on taxation and on the possible VAT increase, on real bread and butter issues that affect their bottom line. That to me indicates a level of consciousness around middle class aspirations and wanting to be part of that kind of strata of the economy and of society. So I do think there are some instances and data points where we are seeing that. And I think it's likely to increase going forward. You might also see an element of that in how people vote in next year's local government elections, where they will focus more on parties that they think can deliver on some of these middle class aspirations. We do have, coupled with that, a bit of an issue with more established parts of our middle class, where in parts of our urban metros, where citizens' households feel that political parties haven't delivered, and you see voter participation declining. So we'll see if any political parties can capture some of those voters, those households that have become disillusioned with sort of political status quo. Gerbrandt, I'm going to ask you around what we can do to get the middle class to spend more. So one of the questions here around non-financial institutions and the money on which they sit. We covered this in one of our most recent risk alerts. So non-financial institutions sit on 1.8 trillion rand. As is often highlighted, South Africa doesn't necessarily lack for resources and money, but households and companies are not willing to deploy that. They're very concerned about the policy status quo, about the governance status quo, and about risks, of course, that they encounter on a daily basis. So what do you think, if anything, can the middle class do to get those non-financial companies to spend that money and to influence government? So things like infrastructure, education, etc.
Yeah, I think it relates back to confidence that businesses, investors, and the ordinary person on the ground has when they look at how the South African economy is performing. The problem is that the country is only growing at most by 1%. That's a very, very low growth environment for an emerging market such as South Africa. The problem is that the government is unwilling to implement the types of reforms that's going to increase the level of investment and lift economic growth to the types of levels needed for an emerging market such as South Africa to move people off from, or rather away from, extreme poverty levels. So it's a policy issue. The GNU has there was a lot of optimism surrounding the Government of National Unity, the GNU, to implement the types of reforms to boost growth. That hasn't materialized, and I think that is now reflected, especially in that slide that I showed about consumer confidence by high income earners, businesses, wealthier households, and low income households are all wary of the economic future of the country. So I think what the government needs to do is to create an environment that is more conducive for business, less regulation, less bureaucracy, take away policies that are especially harmful for the little guy, for small businesses. The national minimum wage is something that big companies and businesses with a lot of resources, that's something that they can afford. It's not something that small or medium enterprises can afford. We're living in 2025. Technology is advancing at a ever more rapidly rate, and that requires the type of education system that prepares a workforce to be absorbed into the new economy that is emerging. And South Africa, if we just look at South Africa, the biggest share of our economy is services orientated, but our education system prepares people to only work in the primary and secondary industries, which are all declining industries. And so there's kind of a skills mismatch that is present in the country, and that's definitely an issue that is seriously neglected in this country, and I think the government just needs to show domestic and international investors that it is serious about reform and growth. And I think it's a hard sell for investors when 2026, the 2026 municipal elections is around the corner, and yet the South Africa's most important city, Johannesburg, is unable to provide a stable supply of water for its residents. So reforms in how we do or how our infrastructure is managed, and we're starting to see some of that, especially in railways, but it's still not enough. And I think the government needs to try harder to you see that all the time, where the government will talk about boosting economic growth, lowering unemployment, but taking those steps, taking action, that's what needs to happen, and that's something that is not happening in a very, very crucial time for South Africa, with the uncertainty in the world at the moment.
I think maybe a point to reinforce as well, just in terms of the middle class getting those non-financial companies to deploy more resources, but also to try and influence government policy. Some of possible advice that we could give in that regard is, if anyone watching, an individual, your household, your business, if you're part of a medical aid, one of the bigger medical aids, of those bigger medical aids in the country, attend their AGMs, attend other companies in which you have shares, attend their AGMs, ask questions about the kinds of policies that they support, the forums in which they engage. Maybe it might be NEDLAC, it could be entities like BUSO or Business for South Africa. Ask what they think of the NHI, of prescribed assets, of expropriation without compensation. Are they administering their resources correctly? Are they sort of going along to get along, or are they advocating for the kinds of policies, the kinds of pro-growth policies that South Africa needs? Not just the middle class, but I think all sort of income classes and in our society. There's also a point just around engaging with organizations such as the Institute of Race Relations, and be it through direct funding, be it through sharing the research papers that the Institute publishes, other organizations such as Sakeliga, the Free Market Foundation, supporting those ideas and sharing those as widely, as far as possible. You never know, you might not influence the one person that you're talking to, but those listening to you in conversations, you never know where some of these ideas might find fertile ground, and that then builds the sort of groundswell of support for different ideas, the right kinds of ideas that South Africa needs. And it starts to shift the balance of forces towards those political parties, those NPOs and NGOs, those religious organizations, those community organizations that then put pressure on government at a more concentrated, serious level. We have one question around what we think could be done to prioritize the middle class, anything around tax reform, home ownership, labor markets. Maybe I'll push back a little bit on that in terms of prioritizing the middle class, where I think if government takes care of things like strengthening property rights, and also the very basic thing of not pursuing destructive policy, more aggressive employment equity initiatives, those kinds of things, that already removes so much of the negative sentiment for the middle class, for deploying capital. If government takes care of the basics, so of service delivery, electricity, water, that removes those extra forms of taxation that middle class households have to pay. That would already remove some of the pressure on them, and indeed on households in various other income strata. Harry, a question around voter apathy. Again, this is a data point that we do track quite regularly, arguably since 1996. In every election, unfortunately, voter participation has declined. So a question specifically, so much rests on government reform and policies, but they don't seem to be able to deliver. If voters feel the GNU is also not delivering, will they look to more autocratic, maybe more populist options? I think that's quite a real possibility.
Yeah, I think when you look at the elections and the outcomes of the elections, I think the voter apathy is quite strong in township areas, in the underdeveloped areas, whereas in the wealthy areas, people have more of a sense of who to vote for, or are more driven to go out and vote. But yeah, I think the risk, of course, especially in South Africa, is that we have one of the highest unemployment rates in the world. We've got one of the highest crime rates, murder rates in the world. We've got one of the highest inequality rates in the world. So that's obviously a fertile ground for social unrests, but also for more populist political parties to gain traction and have a bigger say and have influence on the policy debate at the national level. I think the risk here is that the longer these major issues go unaddressed, and it's not being addressed effectively under the government of national unity, that likelihood of more populist policy proposals coming to the forefront, that remains a big risk. I think, as I mentioned earlier, the middle class is a moderating force in politics. But the problem with South Africa is that our middle class is quite small. It's 20%, and so it's the way we can mitigate populism is to look at the type of economic policies that have helped other poor countries reach developed and advanced status. And those are usually policies where the government does not intervene much in the economy. So I think if, parties that are promote less political intervention in the economy, and also civil society groups who are also in that, who also hold that perspective, if those groups can provide pressure, or at least stimulate the debate on the type of economic policies that have a good track record, if they can bring that to the table and keep that pressure on, then I think we can avert a further shift towards a more populist type of political system.
I think that is a very good note on which to wrap up, and I think a good call to action. A big part of the work we do at the CRA in collecting all this data and providing the analysis is to try and equip businesses, not only to mitigate the risks of doing business in South Africa, but trying to take action and sort of engage in the world around your business, and then also make sure that you set yourself up to take advantage of the opportunities. So with our middle class under so much pressure, if some of our policy and growth fundamentals can shift in a positive direction, we're seeing more competition in our politics. That opens up more space for the right kind of ideas to flourish, more so than they had when we just had effective one-party dominance in national government. So that's part of the challenge that we face. A lot of the feedback that we at the CRA have received this year in briefings to businesses and audience in places like Europe, in Washington, in Argentina, there's a great admiration for South African businesses and the resilience of South African citizens and generally of our society. That resilience, don't discount that. I know one is a bit in sort of survival mode a lot of the time, but that does equip one's household, one's business to take advantage of things when they do shift in our favor. So let's see if that can continue. Let's see what kind of more policy changes we can push for in all our different spheres, different platforms, to make sure that our middle class gets some more breathing room at the very least, and then also starts to grow more to the kind of place that it should be in a developing, emerging market. But on that note, we are going to wrap up. Gerbrandt, thank you very much once again for all of your research, your time with us today. To all of you who joined us, thank you very much for your time. To our premium clients, a special shout out and thank you for joining us. And if you are not yet a premium client of the CRA, we invite you to contact us today for a briefing or for more information about services and products that we offer at the CRA. Until next time, this has been Chris Hutting and Gerbrandt van Heerden for the Center for Risk Analysis. Take care, everybody. See you soon. Bye-bye.